Christopher Columbus, the man, died more than 500 years ago, but Columbus, the legend, lives on. Every Columbus Day, while some celebrate the man, others reject the narrative that he actually landed in the U.S., and many activists speak out about a legacy that they say is part of a broader narrative that contributes to the erasure of indigenous and people of color. Columbus's story of discovering America illustrates the blurred borders between myth and history and how an architect of mass destruction was turned into a national symbol. Today, we dismantle the myth and the legacy of a man that some call hero and others call terrorist. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Nearly a month and a half after the murder of George Floyd, the dismantling of statues across this country began to occur amid a broader reckoning over whose legacy is commemorated and why. At least 40 monuments to Christopher Columbus have been removed since 2018, but the majority happened in 2020 and 2021. Now, more than 130 remain throughout the nation, and although monuments have emerged as a flashpoint in the debate over the country's roots in white supremacy, they are only a drop in a much larger bucket. See, more than 60 cities and counties, including our nation's capital, pay homage to Columbus. Many bear the feminized version of his name, Columbia, which is often overlooked. All told, there are more than 6,000 public references to Columbus across the country, and this doesn't include private businesses, which means the prevalence is probably even greater. Although Columbus never ever stepped foot in the continent of the United States, Columbus is the third most memorized person, or not memorized, memorialized person in this country, behind Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. Ooh, today we're asking why. Here for my leadoff discussion is Dr. Shannon Speed. She's a tribal citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. She is the director of the American Indian Studies Center, and she's a professor of gender studies and anthropology at UCLA. She's also the author of multiple books, including Incarcerated Stories, Indigenous Women, Migrants, and Violence in the Stellar Capitalist State. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Speed.
Good morning.
So, Dr. Speed, today, Columbus Day is being celebrated across this country. Banks are closed, post offices are closed, some private businesses are even closed, but there's so much mystery around this man, Christopher Columbus. So, in a nutshell, can you just tell us, who was Christopher Columbus?
Well, Christopher Columbus was a brutal man who is celebrated as an intrepid navigator. He was, in fact, lost when he reached the Americas. He was trying to find Asia. He proceeded, after arriving in the Americas, to engender rape, enslavement, and wholesale slaughter of the peoples who were living on this continent.
And so we know many students learned that this little passage that in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But since we know Columbus was not the first, foreign explorer to explore or try to explore the Americas, and we know, as you just said, he never even stepped foot here. He was lost. Why the myth? Why the glorification of a man that never even landed in the Americas?
Well, I think that really goes right to the heart of the matter. I think the establishment of Columbus Day, which is, now being replaced in widespread fashion by Indigenous Peoples Day, was, celebrated as kind of a move against widespread racism against Italian Americans at the time. But in fact, it was taken up by the federal government because it supported a particular and quite celebratory narrative about what was, in fact, the invasion, colonial imposition, and genocide of the original inhabitants of this continent.
I read something very interesting by Professor Jean Dennison. She's at the University of Washington. I'm sure she's a colleague. She has written extensively about Columbus and the history of Columbus. And I read something where she says that Columbus was written into the American origin story as a way for Italian Americans to themselves align with whiteness and colonialism. Is that your take on what was happening?
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think it's important to point out for your audience, for people listening today, that not all Italian Americans feel any affinity with Columbus, and many would very much like to see the celebration of Italian American heritage separated from the legacy of this brutal man.
But talk to us about those Italian Americans who do, or the ones that Professor Dennison is writing about. Because I wasn't, I was quite frankly, shocked myself to learn that. I didn't know that was a part of what makes some Italians, again, we're not generalizing across all, but some Italian Americans associate with Columbus as their way of, establishing their whiteness and trying to gain, I guess, privilege by proximity.
Right, and I think many people are surprised by that in current discussions. But it is important to understand that Italian Americans were suffering severe racism in this country at that time. And in 1937, the Knights of Columbus advocated strongly for the establishment of Columbus Day in order to really link themselves up with that celebratory legacy of the arrival of whiteness and the dominance of whiteness on this continent.
And so today, again, as you just pointed out, many cities and nations or counties across this country are acknowledging Indigenous Peoples Day rather than Columbus Day. But still, as I said in my opening, there are thousands and thousands of references to Columbus and the feminine version, Columbia, in this country, and in cities like our capital still pay homage to this man. Why do you think, despite us now coming into a realization of his brutal history, we're having such a hard time just denouncing him?
Well, I think, as you pointed out, this country is in a process of, hopefully, in a process of coming to terms with its legacy of white supremacy and brutality against Native peoples. And I think, that's a process, but it seems to me, and I'm hopeful that we are moving in the right direction. More than 15 states, several hundred cities have changed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. I think that's the direction we will continue to go, but it might take some time. And the truth is that there is still a strong sentiment in some parts of this country about celebrating whiteness and the colonial legacy.
I want to bring into the conversation Rita Yates. Rita is an author and a community historian. Good morning, Rita. Thank you for joining the conversation. So as a community historian, I imagine a big part of what you do is to help people in the community, put history in perspective. What do people in the community in which you work, how do they view Columbus and the celebration of Columbus Day?
Well, honestly speaking, I'm from Columbus, Ohio, so I'm in a double-edged sword with the city being named after him. But I honestly believe that we're in a place where history has affected us and it's embedded in the thread of who we are. And I think at this point, we've created an opportunity for us to unthread history. Basically, we've become used to it. And the idea of wanting to evolve history is something we have to be intentional about. And as a community historian, so often we're wrapped up in what it is that we know versus once it is that we learn new information, how to engage that and change that.
And Dr. Speed, there have been changes, consistent with what Rita says, as new information has been made available to people, people's opinions and positions evolve. Help us understand the evolution of the Columbus story, because it wasn't always the case that he was this celebrated American that, has this incredible origin story.
Absolutely. I mean, well, there's two things about that. One is that over time, more documents have come to light. So we know more about Columbus's actions, his activities. So that has helped our thinking about him as a historical figure to evolve. But I also think that our interpretation of historical figures is ideological, right? And so it's tied to what the current ideological thinking is in the country. And so at a particular point in time, Columbus served a purpose, right, for, again, linking kind of Italian-American heritage to a process, a project of whiteness in this country and of colonization. And we're in a different moment now where many Italian-Americans would not want to be tied to that legacy. So the interpretation of Columbus changes over time based on ideological shifts.
And Rita, some defend him. Some, people, Italians and non-Italians, are very vocal in their defense of Columbus. And many say he was just following the Spanish and Portuguese trading and slave practices of the day, and that it's not fair to single him out as doing something that was unusual. That was, the enslavement of people, the trading of people was the order of the day. What do you say in response to that?
Well, we tell our children all the time, once we know better, we do better. And when there is a particular era of history, and then we honor that particular era based on the information we have. But once the information evolves and we begin learning more, we're held responsible for that. And I think in America, we've just become comfortable with the story. And now that we are in a place where we're having these conversations, how difficult or how easy is it for us to continue to push this under the rug? We're held responsible for the truth. And what better time to talk about the truth?
And Professor Sneed, in Abraham Lincoln, I read that it's actually his Secretary of the Navy that brought, Columbus's story or his voyage, a personal journal of his voyage, to the attention of Abraham Lincoln. Help us understand, even dating back to that period in our history, who was the architect of creating this mythical Christopher Columbus? Because it didn't start in 1937 when you said the Knights of Columbus, advocated for the passage of this national holiday. The myth started well before 1937.
Absolutely. And so, again, it's been kind of brought up over the years to serve different purposes, right? It served a particular purpose in the era of Abraham Lincoln. It was raised again and actually declared for the first time a national holiday, a one-time national holiday the exact date is going to escape me, but the late 1890s, when several Italian Americans were murdered in a racially motivated crime. And so, it has been brought up in different moments to serve different kind of purposes.
But why Columbus? There were so many other explorers that, were obviously more successful even than he was. So, Dr. Speed, so why Columbus? Why was he singled out to be this mythical character that, founded the Americas?
I'm not certain why Columbus, but I don't think that any of the others that surrounded him in his day would necessarily have had a more positive legacy. And I think it's important to point out also that even in his day, his crimes were recognized. He was essentially fired and recalled by the crown for his activities. So it's not as if even in his day, everybody thought he was doing a great job.
So you say to those folks who defend him by saying he was following the practices of that day, you would say even in his time, his actions were extraordinarily brutal, I should say.
They were extraordinarily brutal by any standards, and they were not universally accepted in his day.
And so, Rita, given that, how did they, how did they clean this up? We've seen this happen with other historical figures, but as Dr. Speed said, even in his day, his actions were considered, incredibly brutal. So how did, the process happen of cleaning up this story?
I think we struggle with that question to this very day. because there's so many different groups that have different beliefs as far as what he did for their community. I know, just speaking from an African American perspective, we know for a fact that America will hold on to a story when we know the facts are indifferent to the optimism of that particular person. So I think we're held responsible for learning the information, but not only learning it, but teaching it in its true factual and be, real about it. Sorry in my interpretation of it, but really, I think the biggest thing walking away is understanding that they're a part of the story. And for so long, we didn't have to tell the story. So we're held accountable at this point to tell the story and be honest about it.
And Dr. Speed, we saw in 1992 kind of a backlash. We saw a pendulum swing where we started to hear more people speaking up, decrying this mythological story. What was happening in 1992 to cause that backlash?
Well, the 500-year anniversary of the arrival on this continent, of Columbus's arrival on the continent. So that declared Indigenous people, the Year of Indigenous Peoples. There were celebrations taking place all across the continent, and really, organizing Indigenous people and people coming together to say, what is this history? We need to highlight this history. And it was the first time that we saw statues of Columbus being taken down, particularly in Latin American countries.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Speed. Thank you so much, Rita, for joining me this morning. We have to leave it there. Such a fascinating history of a complicated man. That it's just still kind of mind-boggling that he has been held up as a hero for hundreds of years, and to this day, as I said, monuments still exist, and cities and states across this country still are applauding him for what we now know was just a brutal and inhumane treatment of so many Indigenous people. Again, thank you for sharing your insights with me this morning. Okay, my next guest is Sharla Stevens. She's the founder of Healing Racism in Schools and is an anti-racist school consultant. Sharla, good morning. Let me say that to you first.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Great. Glad to talk with someone because, this myth about someone like you, because the myth about Christopher Columbus starts really early. It starts in school. For some, it may start in their home as they're toddlers. But we know by the time you get to elementary school, you are being taught lessons about Christopher Columbus. And these are all nice, cheery, happy, lessons about a man that they say we should all revere. What's happening in schools today? Are we still teaching about Christopher Columbus the way we were 20 years ago?
Unfortunately, the myths of Christopher Columbus are still in our schools. I remember when my son, when he's 9 years old now, but I remember when he came home singing a song about Christopher Columbus, and I was like, yeah, we don't do that here. That doesn't happen here. And the problem is that when it starts that young, it's really hard to unlearn later on, right? And that's why I fight white supremacy in our schools, is because that's where the indoctrination happens. And so then later on, when you try to talk to adults, when their earliest memories say that this man should be revered, it's really hard for them to understand that this man was always a criminal. He was always a pedophile. He was always a genocider, and he should have never been revered. And that's hard for a lot of people to wrestle with. But if we're doing the right thing, it's just what makes sense.
But you're saying, I know you have contracts with several large school districts across the country. And if you look at the curriculum that's being taught in those schools today about Christopher Columbus, does it differ from what was taught in schools 10 or 15, 20 years ago?
It depends on where you are. I work with a lot of schools in the San Francisco Unified School District, and they're doing a much better job of getting rid of this history that's been sanitized and doing a better job of teaching the truth. But that's not, we know that that's not true across the country. We have several states, 16, 17, who are banning critical race theory, banning any type of conversation around white supremacy and the horrors of white supremacy. So you asked earlier, why is it that we still celebrate and revere this man when we know that he's a horrible person? And I think that really speaks to, the agenda of the day has always been to hide the crimes of white supremacy. We don't talk about American genocide. We talk about the genocide that happened in Europe with the Nazis. We don't talk about the 100 million Native peoples that lived on these lands. I taught history in our classrooms, and I would teach U.S. history, and it didn't start with the Native Americans, and that always just baffled me. So I think that it's not a surprise.
Where does history in U.S. schools, when you taught history, where did they start American history if they didn't start it with Native Americans?
I mean, they start at fleeing from the English. They start from, they start from the story of Jamestown and, coming over here. But they don't really speak much to the fact that these lands were inhabited. And they don't speak to that a genocide took place in order for white folks to take over these lands. So there's a lot of, even in history books that are used on the West Coast, where it's a little less of that revisionist history, it's still very sanitized. It's still very much to center the comfort of whiteness. That's what our schools do. They center the comfort of whiteness, and we do not care about the discomfort of Black and brown people or people of color, Indigenous people. That does not concern us. And you see that by the fact that we don't even start with the fact that our history starts with 100 million people on these lands before genocide took place. And you also see it with the way we talk about enslavement.
And let's go back to that period, because that's really fascinating to me. I'm a history buff, and I'm thinking back to what you're saying. And yes, we start with Jamestown, and we start with the colonies, and then we get to these happy stories about Thanksgiving, which is, a whole nother piece. But help us understand the order of magnitude in terms of the crimes committed by Christopher Columbus, because we hear the broad stroke that, he committed genocide, that he enslaved people, that he was involved in slave trading. But how many people, if it's known, did he either kill or that he enslaved?
I don't have those numbers, but the way I look at it is he ushered in the genocide of over 100 million Native peoples. I think that all of the entire genocide that happened in Central America, that happens in Canada, Native America, all of that, because of the precedent that he set that ushered in white supremacy and colonization. I feel like it's not just what he did in his lifetime. It is the legacy. So even when we speak to the Pledge of Allegiance, the Pledge of Allegiance was written by Francis Bellamy. He is the one that ushered in the Columbus holiday. And he also, he was a white supremacist minister, and he wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. And he wanted to write the Pledge of Allegiance as as an oath or a symbol of nationalism to Columbus. And it was at a time when America was super xenophobic. We're always xenophobic, but where white America was really trying to establish who's white and who's not. Right? So who's truly an American and who's not an American. So it was all about claiming your allegiance, and it was all about nationalism, and it was all about, white supremacy. And originally you did a Nazi salute, and they changed that around World War II.
Where the Pledge of Allegiance?
The Pledge of Allegiance had a salute that looked more like a Nazi salute. They changed it during World War II to hand on your heart. So there is a deep history of white supremacy and racism within the Pledge of Allegiance. And then throughout our schools, Black and brown kids and Indigenous kids are being forced to say this oath. And that's illegal too. That violates the necessary and proper cause, or one of those causes where you're not supposed to mix. You're not supposed to have that in schools. They're supposed to present them with an opportunity to say it, but it's optional.
Right.
But often Black kids are criminalized, or other kids of color are criminalized because they don't want to say it, which is what happened in Florida, where a little Black middle schooler was arrested. The police came in because he refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance, which absolutely has ties in white supremacy.
No, and that's an excellent point. And you're right. Parents have a right to tell their kids if they want to opt out of saying the Pledge of Allegiance. They absolutely should be allowed to opt out, and they shouldn't be arrested or criminalized or suspended, expelled, or face any disciplinary actions as a result of opting out. Let's go back to, what should be taught. So I know you work on helping schools develop anti-racist curricula, in the school district. We know that we're starting with Jamestown, so we're not teaching the original history of what was happening as if, before the colonizers got here from England. But what should we be teaching kids about American history?
So I would definitely want to reference back to the leaders in the Native society and ask them what they would think. But from my limited understanding, if nothing else, the truth, because we need to. But
the truth, and I guess that's what I'm saying, that the truth, Sharla, is, I guess, for many, whose eyes is the truth seen through? Because if there's so many conflicting stories about our history. And so if you're an educator and you're trying to teach the truth, what is that truth?
Well, one truth that we know for sure is that the Native people were genocided by white people, and that white supremacy is a foundation of our country. That's how we were established, right? So these are stolen lands by genocided the people that were here. I know that there's still a significant Native population, but not compared to what was here. And then it was developed by stolen people, right? So just those truths, we could start to have a conversation. And then when we talk about white supremacy and racism, it's not going to be like, oh, wow, does that still exist? We know it exists because it's the foundation of our country. So like we're in denial of that. We're in denial that that's who we are as a country. We don't want to be real about that. And we need to. It starts in our schools. So instead of this idea that, the Pilgrims and the Natives lived in harmony, they didn't. And this idea that, that we paint this picture that the Natives were so hostile to these invaders. We need to frame it in the sense that if somebody came into your home with some guns and started raping your siblings and your family and took over your lands, would you feel some type of way about that? So just the way that it is taught is from a white perspective, it's from a white supremacist perspective. And so that's what we've always done. And we need to do something else. So there's all kinds of resources out there where you can hear this history and learn this history from the perspective of the people who are affected by it. Because I give this example in my classroom. If there was a fight at lunch, like me and another teacher got into a fight, right? And at the end of the fight, that teacher's dead. Whose story are you going to hear? Are you going to hear their side of the story? Or are you going to hear my side of the story, right? You're only going to get one side of that story. And that's what we have in our history. And we've heard that side. We've heard the side that glorifies these vile white men who are criminals. Columbus was a pedophile. That's it for me. He was a pedophile. Why is there any more discussion after that? He dismembered people. He would send these children to be victimized. He thought the ideal age for a woman sexually was under 13. That's the man that we're celebrating. And you also talked about, I think earlier one of your speakers mentioned that Abraham Lincoln, Washington, and Columbus are the three most revered and most taught about in our schools. And all of them were white supremacists. All of them contributed to, horrific crimes against humanity. So I question what is the qualifiers for white heroes, white American heroes. And I feel like it's who advanced white supremacy the furthest in this country. That's what I feel like they're not going to say that, but I feel like that's the agenda. Who advanced white supremacy the furthest, which makes sense that Christopher Columbus would be, number one.
Well, I'm glad you bring up the pedophile piece because obviously not talked about often, if at all, that part of his history and the part of sexualizing young girls at 13. And when you do hear those kinds of comments made, there's usually this excuse that somehow that was the time and he shouldn't be judged by what was happening during that time. But I do want to ask you, is there any country that you know of, and you're a historian, that's doing a better job? Because we know the U.S. is doing a horrible job of teaching, factual history. Is England or Germany or Spain or any other country that you are aware of teaching factually what happened, to establish America, the explorers who explored America?
I don't see that with countries that have a white supremacy problem. So, and that's a lot, right? White supremacy is a global problem. I spoke about what was going on in the schools in the UK, and it's very similar. So I feel like, part of whiteness, the thing about whiteness is it's made up. It's made up and it's connected to white supremacy, which is directly connected to anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenousness. So it's like, as long as you are holding on to this identity of whiteness, then you're holding on to this idea, this fallacy of white supremacy. And so white supremacy does not tell on itself. White supremacy does these horrible crimes and then hides them from history and then sanctions whiteness. And then it has this idea that that should be our ideal. So in general, that's not what white people do. That's not what they do. They don't do it here. They don't do it anywhere. And so I think that one of the things that white folks need to do is to get a new identity. You need to redefine yourselves in a way that's not oppressive to other peoples.
When you say that to school superintendents, when you go in with this racist agenda and suggest that, curricula needs to be changed to reflect that, what kind of pushback do you get?
Well, not everybody is my client. I don't take everybody on, and I don't work with everybody because I'm not going to waste my time, and I don't do performative stuff. The pushback is that, especially now, there's so much learning loss with what happened with Corona that we really just don't have time to address this as well. And one of the things I say is, as a Black woman, I don't get to pick and choose. I had to deal with Corona and racism and misogyny. Like, I don't get to pick and choose. Neither do my children, right? They don't get to pick and choose either. So, or we just don't have the budget and we just don't have the time. And the budget's big because people do not want to really commit resources to this, because for white people it makes them uncomfortable, right? And a lot of times when it comes to putting money in the pockets of Black and brown people, they don't want to do that. They want to lowball us. They want to think that this doesn't come with a commitment. You have to have a budget, right? And then the work, like it's more than professional development and meetings and all of that. You have to be committed to doing the work on the long term, and you have to be willing to be uncomfortable. So there's a lot of we're just very used to centering white comfort. That's just what's familiar to us. And, even as a Black woman, it's what's familiar for me. And I think that on a DNA level, there's that trauma that's within our bodies. So like when we have made white people uncomfortable in the past, that has come with a detrimental, price, right? We paid a detrimental price for that. So there's a lot of that fear of upsetting white people. But until we disrupt whiteness, nothing changes. And so for me, my passion comes from these kids are suffering. I don't have time for your discomfort because children are dying. That's my priority.
Well, thank you so much, Sharla. Wow, a powerful statement. And, you're right. Making white people uncomfortable is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's true, right? We get uncomfortable, like even just talking about it. We're taught to be uncomfortable to even, talk about being uncomfortable. So.
It is. And people should know that. Like I post a lot on LinkedIn and I say a lot of bold things, but my heart races, my armpits are sweating, but I am Sharla Stevens and the ancestors, and they hold me accountable. And I am more afraid of them, real talk, than I am of whatever society might do.
I think I was going to let you go, but I think we have some of those posts, right, Rashad, from Sharla? And that's how I found you, because you retweeted a provocative quote that basically said F Christopher Columbus.
Yeah.
I think it's been taken down now, but I was looking for people who were, speaking truth to power about Christopher Columbus, and I came across you because of that. We know social media is so powerful, and you can, disseminate messages, and oftentimes uncomfortable messages that maybe aren't going to be printed in your local paper, right? New York Times isn't going to run that, that finger sign that says F Christopher Columbus, but you can post it on social. And it is uncomfortable. And I appreciate you being honest about that, because I think all of us who are having these conversations, and I have these conversations on the special report almost daily, and I get a lot of pushback from folks who, call me a racist, and, I'm as far from a racist as, I am from a rock. So from being a rock.
People don't know that. People don't understand what racist really means. Can I speak to that really briefly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Racism is racial prejudice plus institutional power. And so you will have Black people and Indigenous people and people of color who are discriminatory or who are bigoted. You will have all of that. And they're going to also ingest a lot of the same bigoted beliefs that society has. But that's not the same thing as racism. Racism is when you're able to basically, for example, whitewash the curriculum to glorify white supremacy so that all kids have to learn about this pedophile Christopher Columbus. That's a perfect example of a racist belief that's been institutionalized. So now it's passed out to all the kids who go through our schools. So I can have all the opinions I want about white folks. I can't make it curriculum. That's the difference, right? I can't institutionalize it. So that's why you can't be racist. I can't be racist. I can be discriminatory. I can be prejudiced, but I can't be racist.
Yeah, and talking about whiteness and talking about dismantling white supremacy doesn't make you a bigot. Doesn't make you a person who harbors, bigotry in your heart, or that you're, engaged in discriminatory conduct. You're not discriminating against white people because you talk about dismantling white supremacy, and people get that wrong. And they think whenever you talk about, whiteness and white supremacy and, structural racism, that somehow you are a bigot yourself. And that's not true. We have to talk about it to dismantle it. And in
But white society is taught not to talk about it. They're taught that if you don't mention race, you're not racist, which is why when they'll say, like, they'll refer to me like, yeah, you're black, right? They want to whisper it, right? And it's like, I'm black, right? I'm not black. I'm black, right? Very different, but they're taught not to mention race. And they're also taught, and because they don't see race, like, because they don't talk about it, they don't see their own. Like, so white teachers specifically don't recognize that they're white teachers, right? And so you stand in front of a classroom of color and you say, I can do it because, or you can do it because I did it. And they don't want to speak to white privilege. They don't want to speak to white supremacy is working for you. The GI Bill is working for you. All these things are legacy admissions and colleges are working for you. All these things are working for you. And what that does in our classrooms is create mistrust. So you have students of color whose lives are dependent on understanding and navigating through white supremacy, but you want to play games and act like white supremacy doesn't exist, but my life is at risk. Yeah. So you're telling me that my life is not important to you. And that's what causes a lot of the problems in our classroom is these white teachers don't want to speak to white supremacy, but you're in front of students of color who understand that if they don't know how the rules of the game, they could be the next George Floyd or Breonna or Sandra Bland, right? So that's the problem in our schools.
Yeah, I'm going to keep you, Sharla. If you got a minute, stay with us because I want to bring on this dynamic husband and wife team, Sandy Bigtree, because I asked you the question about what should be taught, and you said you want to be deferential to people who are part of this community. And so I have my next two guests. Sandy Bigtree is a part of this community, so I want to hear what she has to say about what should be taught in our schools. She's a citizen of the Mohawk Nation. And she's a founding board member, Indigenous Values Initiative. And her husband is Dr. Philip Arnold. He's an associate professor and chair, Department of Religion at Syracuse University. He's also a prolific author, has multiple books out. And one of his books is Gift of Sports, Indigenous Ceremonial Dimensions of the Games We Love. Welcome, Sandy, and welcome Dr. Arnold, who tells me to call him Phil. So welcome, Phil, and welcome, Sandy. And I'm keeping Sharla because Sharla works in the school districts and she's talking to superintendents and principals about curriculum. And she said something I think that was very respectful, Sandy. She says, look, we're not getting it right, but we should defer to, members of the Indigenous community about what should be taught. So as a member of the Mohawk Nation, tell us what schools should be teaching, Sandy.
Well, what underlines all of this is the age of discovery, of course, coming into these new lands under the edicts of the Pope at the time. I wanted to say that prior to the so-called discovery of the Americas, Europe at the Pope's dictate went into West Africa because of all the gold. And there were so many resources, among which was gold predominantly, that was extracted, that became the driving force, seriously, for Columbus to go searching. It wasn't about tea and herbs and spices. I mean, seriously. And so when Columbus set sail here, he was lost, landed on a continent, assuming it was India. And he discovered gold. Huge quantities of gold. And he went back to Europe and he wrote a letter to the monarchs of Spain that there was this enormous wealth of gold. And this was March 15th, 1943, that he penned this document. And 6 weeks later, the Pope, who was the infamous Borgia Pope, who was a merchant. They were merchant families. They weren't raised to be priests or popes. They were raised to be in power. And so it was May 4th of 1493 that the Pope wrote the edict to extend that discovery into the Americas. The Pope, the decree that was written in pertaining to West Africa was stating, for Catholic sovereigns to seize lands of heathens, capture, vanquish, and subdue all non-Christians and put them in perpetual slavery and take all their possessions and property. So this is what underlines the age of discovery, the accumulation of wealth. And when they came to the Americas, they saw this enormous North and South America and Canada, this enormous wealth. And then it was just the slaughter of Native people from that point on. I wear today this Indigenous Peoples Day, this bright orange ribbon to remember and hold in our hearts all the children's remains that are currently being excavated from the boarding schools in Canada and the United States. And they're just touching the tip of this iceberg, right? We live in Haudenosaunee territory. The colonized name the Jesuit priests gave us were Iroquois, so that may be more resonating to you. But we are the Haudenosaunee people. We are of this land. The Haudenosaunee, they didn't control a mass, but they influenced the northeastern quadrant of North America in what is now the United States. And they were organized by a matrilineal clan system of peace, known as the Great Law, the Great Binding Peace. And it was a peace that can only be attained when you're in proper relationship with the natural world. So therein lies the conflict. You have colonizers coming in wanting to extract everything. And then you have the peoples that live in balance. We have a Columbus statue in Syracuse. We reside in Onondaga Nation territory, which remain the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee. And that's where all the 6 nations come to gather in peace. And these are the traditional leaders that still have clans that have denied the Bureau of Indian Affairs coming in and forcing elective systems on our people. We had a whole other way of coming to agreement, and that was by consensus. Mm-hmm. And so this is a very powerful part of the country. The founding fathers met with these matrilineal clan representatives during the founding of this country because they needed to gain insight into their power and influence. And I really believe that's what they were after. But the Klan leadership would go down to Philadelphia. And the second floor of Independence Hall was actually reserved for lodging them. Mm-hmm. And so there's all this documentation that the Haudenosaunee were trying to convey to these new aliens about this notion of peace and living in balance with this natural world. And at a point, the Americans turned on Britain because they knew darn well if they were going to achieve what they were setting out to achieve, they needed slaves. And slavery had been outlawed in England shortly before America gained its independence as the United States. So this is a really rich history. No, it's not being taught in the schools, right? Sharla was talking about the Nazi salute during the Pledge of Allegiance. Yeah, fascism was really strong in the United States during World War II and leading up to it. And we had an Italian community here, very strong, wonderful artists and cooks, and, brought so much color to this city and life and vibrancy. But they were downtrodden and there was a lot of racism, right? So they formed a group and they solicited the monies to pay for a sculptor in Florence to build a Columbus statue so they could have it erected here in Syracuse. And in 1934, that dream came true at the help of Mussolini because they didn't have the funds to see it through. So he paid to have this sculpture from Florence shipped here, and he had it enlarged. He wanted it bigger, and he wanted to say Columbus, discoverer of the Americas. Why? So he had a heavy influence all around here, right? And so that's how that statue got raised in Syracuse.
Is it still there today, or has it been removed?
No, the mayor says he's working on it, but the mayor's being sued by the Monument Corporation group that's trying to keep it remaining. So it's a major battle going on. So it sits right in the heart of the city. It sits with its back to the courthouse so that he has the backing of law. Yeah. And his gaze goes through the Church of the Immaculate Conception, the largest Catholic church in Syracuse. and his gaze, which he gazes directly west.
Let me ask
So
Phil.
that's, pardon me?
Hold on a second, Sandy. I want Phil to jump into the conversation.
Yeah.
Phil, help us understand the devastation that Columbus, caused. Sharla said, for her, he represents the beginning of this, or he's a representative of this genocide that happened to, the native people who were here before the explorers came to North America. But has anyone documented how many people were killed, how many people were enslaved as a result of Columbus's actions?
Yeah, I think that work's been done, but like others on your show, I haven't really studied that directly. So it's I don't know about the numbers, but in addition to him being essentially a pimp for these children, he transported slaves, Native Americans, directly back to the Spanish royals on his first voyage, right? So he captured people, brought them back. So this was kind of a natural feature of what his mission was, right? To essentially evaluate the kind of enslavement potential of Native Americans. That was already taking place in Africa at the time by Portuguese explorers. So what we have here, what Sandy's describing, and by the way, we are a matrilineal household, so you can see why. I think what Sandy's describing is the doctrine of this Christian discovery and domination, which is a very important category for understanding the relationship in really just religious history, relationship between the enslavement of indigenous Africans, as well as the enslavement of American Indians or Native Americans, right? This is all orchestrated between these kingdoms of Europe at the time, as well as the Vatican, right? So this becomes the why Columbus becomes so symbolically important, right? And what I appreciate, we've had this uprising in Black Lives Matter, and that there's a through line right to the dismantling of the Columbus myth history, if you like, right? But it's not just about the man. It's about, as Sharla was saying, it's also about his legacy, right? It's about the foundations of white supremacy that become so endemic to American society. So just a little more on this, because what Sandy's describing is 15th century kind of crazy religion talk, but that then morphs into the land taking of in 1823. There's an important decision made by the Supreme Court, Johnson v. McIntosh, and we're about ready to celebrate the 200th anniversary of that decision, essentially using the doctrine of discovery as a way to take native lands. This becomes then codified as a feature of law, and it's still in effect today. And this is why indigenous peoples all around the world and the United Nations or wherever here in Onondaga Nation territory are still concerned about the doctrine of discovery as still a vital principle of law, right? And that's why we've set up these conferences on the doctrine of discovery.
And Sharla, I'll ask you, one thing we saw Biden do, first president ever, is issue a proclamation acknowledging Indigenous Peoples Day this year. How significant was that for the president of the United States to even just make that proclamation?
It's significant. It's not enough, because you're going to have schools across the country where you can't even teach the history of what that means, of the significance, right? So it's like schools are muzzled as far as really teaching the impact of that. And like I said before, it's not enough when our kids are taught at such a young age to glorify Columbus. And one thing I wanted to speak to what Philip and Sandy said was the genocide of the Native Americans, the taking the land, the enslavement of the African American, what that does is set a precedent in the consciousness of white Americans that you can take from people of color. You can take their lives, you can take their property, you can take their things. They do not have value and they do not have the same rights as white Americans. And so I feel like that's deeply embedded in the subconscious of white Americans and Americans in general, where our lives are not seen as valuable. And you saw that with what's going on with Gabby Petito, right? How many missing Native American women and children and men go missing every year? How many Black men, women, and children go missing every year? But we don't care because white lives are valued and our lives are not. So that's that's just all performative, right? Like we acknowledge Juneteenth, but you can't teach about Juneteenth in schools. So it's just like, it doesn't matter. It's a Band-Aid, but and it's still within the white comfort zone, right? It's easy to say, acknowledge Indigenous Peoples Day. Can you acknowledge that you're living on stolen land? Can you acknowledge that white supremacy has allowed you to have all these advances where you look at what's happening to the Indigenous community and it's devastated? Can we acknowledge that? Can we acknowledge the consequences? So to me, it's very easy for white people to do these types of things, declare Juneteenth a holiday, while taking away our right to be able to talk about it in schools, or declare, Indigenous Peoples Day. But that's not enough. It's not undoing the harms. It's not rectifying anything. It's not reparations. It's not getting land back. It's not any of that. So it's performative. And white people are very good at doing things that are performative.
And so I'll ask you, Sandy. Yes, Sharla, that we know that there's a commission has been formed at the federal level to study reparations, because for African Americans, yes, we want an apology for slavery, but more importantly, we want action, and reparations is one way, not the only, but one way to restore African people who lost, generations of wealth. So what about Native people? Beyond the proclamation from the president, Sandy, what do Native people want to see this government do that it hasn't done to try to restore what was taken and stolen from Native Americans?
Honor Indian treaties, return our land, return, a good part of our land, clean up our waters that you've polluted, so we can all live more healthfully in this shared environment. I don't know, it's a long road. It affects everybody. Yeah. We have this lake in Syracuse where the peacemaker had arrived thousands of years ago, bringing peace to people. It had all kinds of medicinal springs, 5 different kinds of waters coming into this lake. It was so unique and beautiful. Mm-hmm. And Father Lemoyne, in 1656, discovered there was salt there. So they came back with a deed to 600 square miles of land claiming ownership in 1656 because they wanted the salt in that lake. And today it's the most chemically polluted lake in the Americas, second to Chernobyl in the world. Right. And I think, that's a story to be told and to think about, right? Yeah. It's crazy. And we talk about this 15th century doctrine of discovery lingo, like it's something far in the past. But in 2005, the Oneida Nation had filed a land rights action, and they were denied that action with the United States Supreme Court. And it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg that wrote that opinion. And the very first footnote she cited was the doctrines of Christian discovery from the 15th century. They underlie U.S. property law. They're a real thing. And that's what justifies all these corporations going to indigenous territories all over this globe to extract their resources, to continue enslaving them and extracting resources. And if we're going to survive what's ahead with global changing, we've got to start paying attention.
And that's a great way for people to understand what it is that Native American people want. I'll ask you, Phil, about imagery. If you grow up in America, you've watched the cowboy and Indian, series, the movies, the big white actors who became, the famous cowboy that was saving America from the savage, Indians. How do we change? We've seen some movement, to change some of those images with football teams and other teams, but I still think there's this pervasive notion that Indians were somehow these savage people that these good Christian American white people had to, save from themselves. Those, you turn on a TV channel and those Western movies and dramas are on throughout the day. How do we, go about trying to change some of that imagery? Sandy talks about peace, peaceful people who wanted peace, and it was these brutal, violent Americans, coming from Great Britain who were creating the violence.
Right, that's a great question. I think, like I said, if there's one positive, the narrative is changing, right? The history is changing, and we've been at this for 30 years, and it seems like nothing changes. And now people are really paying attention to this. I was watching a football game last night where they're all doing the tomahawk chop. 70,000 fans in the stadium. That to me is bizarre because as Sandy was saying, they're the Haudenosaunee are based all in a matrilineal clan system based on peace. Well, people who live for millennia on this land have to be organized around peace traditions. They're not the stereotype of the warrior. I suppose that's why I'm pushing back against the mascot kind of phenomenon. But it misrepresents who these people are, and that's why we set up the Scano Great Law Peace Center. As Sandy was saying, the Scano Center, which means peace in the Onondaga language, is based on a peace when human beings are in relationship to the natural world, right? In proper relationship. So I'll say, the Indigenous Peoples Day might be an opportunity for us to examine our value systems as Americans, so that it's not just about the past or the present, it's really about the future. I mean, we can't continue to use up the earth in the ways that we have, right? We can't, or use up people that in the ways that we have. We have to come on another value system. We have to develop some other way of dealing with one another and dealing with the planet in a way that's really sustainable. Well, why not listen to the people that, were encountered here by pilgrims, the Spanish and everyone else, so yes, it's symbolic, it's performative, and I agree with that, but maybe it's a start. I mean, and I really appreciate you, Areva, having us on and being able to talk about this, because I think it is important as we move forward.
Yeah, we're running out of time, but Sandy, I have to ask you real quickly, what is it like to live in a matrilineal household versus the patriarchal system that these religious folks decided that America, would follow? So, do you get to run all the money? I'm making up little silly.
Oh, yeah, I do. It's a matter of fact.
I just want to know, for girl power purposes, what would this country look like if we had followed the indigenous people and we were matrilineal instead of patriarchal?
Well, the women assign the names, the clan mothers, which is a title. It's not that any mother is a clan mother because she has a clan. Clan mother has a title, and she stands beside the clan male representative she picks. And she can take him down, if she needs to. And so it's a whole different way of organizing. And it's the clan mother that names each child. And it's a clan name. And that's the relationship that begins that you have with the natural world. It's through your name and your identity. So it's completely different. And the language captures all those nuances. And this ancient language is recognized by the natural world because language comes from the natural world. So, we're talking about really ancient traditions here that are they're still holding on to this,
The clan
in
mother
spite of colonialism.
So the clan mother would be considered the head of the household, not the man?
Yeah, the clan mother. Absolutely.
I love that. Okay, that's a great note for me to end on.
He
Can I ask a
moved
quick
into
question?
her house.
Go ahead, Sharla. I know this is fascinating.
So I read, Sandy, that the Mohawk actually gave Canadians their name. That it was really a word from Indigenous people, and it means those who squat or those who sit on our lands, something like that. Like Canada or Canadian means those who sit on our land,
their home or something like that. Yeah.
I love that. So essentially, calling them squatters. Like you're
But
squatting on our land.
It's also difficult living here and having most of these towns and creeks, they have these ancient names that are Haudenosaunee words for all these places, and so like Hiawatha Boulevard in town, it's like Destiny Mall we have. Down at Onondaga, they like to refer to this enormous mall as Manifest Destiny Mall. It's right on where the birthplace of the peace came. So
Go ahead, Phil. Even though we're matrilineal, we're going to let Phil have the last word.
I get it. Look, no, I let her have the first word. So our sons, our twin sons, who are now adults, understand this very well. So that's the way they were raised. So it really does start, with education. I'll just go back to that. It starts with educating young men. They're also Haudenosaunee. They're all part of the Bear Clan, and they receive their names at a certain time. But it's the women that are responsible for the health of the land. It's the women, and men have their responsibilities. Women have their responsibilities. So this is an ancient system where the clan really determines the health of the territory, and that's why those are value systems. I think that we really need to listen to again. I mean, the founding fathers did. In fact, the women's movement in Seneca Falls, New York, right upstate New York, they were also listening to the women, the clan mothers, and they got in their head, well, wow, why are we slaves to men, right? So these and that kind of combines with the abolition movement, right? So the 19th century as well is interacting with Native people. These are stories we should be telling. Right?
Yeah, I'll just put a point on that the women of Seneca Falls were somewhat listening to the clan mothers because
right.
They were not accepting of Black and brown women as they were fighting, for the rights of all women. So they got that part of the story wrong, because I can imagine from Sandy's version of that, the clan mothers would have been inclusive of all women and not just white women. I've got to end on that note, even though this is an incredibly interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Sharla. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Phil, for enlightening us and helping us understand what's, this holiday, I guess you call it. People get off work, they get paid for it, so it's a holiday. What we should be and shouldn't be doing on this day, and I think we're all very clear that this is a day that we probably should retire. And Christopher Columbus is no one to celebrate. If anything, he's someone to be despised. So again, thank you all for joining me this morning. I just want to thank all of my guests. I learned so much today, and I love a guest that tells me that the clan mothers, not the founding fathers, should have been in charge of this country. That's music to my ears. And again, so much history that is not taught in schools. And it doesn't mean that you as a parent, you as an adult, can't teach it to your kids. The information, as Sharla told us, is out there. It's available to you. And if you are a parent, I'm a parent of 3. If you're a parent, you have an obligation, even if the schools don't get it right. And it's going to take some time. Hopefully over time, schools will get it right, or at least they'll get better at teaching our history. But until they do that, we can all take that responsibility upon ourselves to learn our history and to make sure we are telling the history of all people, and that we are not leading to the erasure of Black and brown and indigenous people, because we are so critical to the foundation and the origins of this country. And if schools won't tell it, we as parents, we can tell it. Just some words of goodbye before I get out. Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Celebrating Columbus ain't like believing in the Easter Bunny or even Santa Claus. Those mythical characters aren't the cause of thousands of deaths and the enslavement of thousands of people. For Native people in the U.S., Columbus Day represents a celebration really of genocide and dispossession. The irony is that, as we've said this morning, Columbus didn't discover anything. Not only was he lost thinking he had landed in India, but there's evidence of transoceanic contact involving explorers not named Columbus prior even to 1492. The day today that celebrates a fictionalized and sanitized version of colonization, whitewashing generations of brutality that many Europeans brought to these shores, it's really time to end that. And although I wholeheartedly support pleas to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, it's not that simple. If these pleas are sincere, any change to Indigenous Peoples Day must be backed up with active recognition of the resilience of Indigenous people and the horrific acts of our founding fathers. And action must be taken to teach school children across this country the true history of the U.S. and make Indigenous people whole. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Wear your mask and remember we're all in this together. And if you're in New York, join me. I will be there next week for 2 book events for my new book, Awakening. I'll be in Harlem at the Harlem School of Arts on October 18th. And I'll be in the Meatpacking District at Alice and Olivia on October 20th. I want to see you in New York. Your awakening awaits you.